The cigar that sank with the Titanic. 92 years before anyone thought to ask the question, the answer was already sitting in a humidor at the bottom of the North Atlantic. On the night of April 14th, 1912, four men climbed a mahogany staircase into one of the most exclusive rooms ever built on water. Stained glass glowed above their heads. A fire crackled in a carved fireplace. And on rolling carts beside them sat large humidors, packed with hand-rolled Cuban cigars, waiting to be smoked by men who had no idea they were living through the final hours of their lives. Somewhere in that room, a cigar band, a small paper ring wrapped around the base of a cigar, carried the name of a brand most people alive today have never heard of. A brand invented by a German immigrant who reshaped the entire cigar industry, then vanished from memory so completely that even serious collectors argue over what actually happened to him. This is the story of that cigar. How a runaway German teenager became Don Gustavo, the uncrowned king of Havana. How his single idea changed the way every cigar on earth would be sold, forever. And how, 2 years after his death, his cigars ended up in the hands of millionaires on a ship that would never see land again. By the end of this story, you'll understand why historians still debate what really happened to his empire, and why, more than a century later, collectors are still hunting for the last physical proof that it ever existed. Why this cigar matters. Most people who've heard of Titanic's first-class smoking room picture brandy, cards and cigar smoke curling toward a stained glass ceiling. Almost nobody knows the actual names on the boxes. According to White Star Line's own 1911 provisioning notes for first-class passengers, the cigars available on board included Fernandez Garcia Vencedores, Jose Morales, Garcia Perlas Finas, and Bock's Rothschild Elegantes, priced at 13 cents apiece. All Cuban, all handmade, all kept in humidors and served on request by the smoking room stewards. Of those four names, one belonged to a man whose influence on the cigar world went far beyond flavor or reputation. Gustav Bock didn't just make good cigars. He invented the object that every cigar smoker on earth still touches today, the cigar band itself. That single detail is why this story matters. This isn't just about a brand that happened to be on a famous ship. It's about the man who changed how the entire world identified, trusted, and collected cigars, and whose own name nearly disappeared along with the identification system he created. The origin story. The man behind the name was born Gustav Bock Müller in Germany in 1837. Sources differ on exactly when he crossed the Atlantic. Some place his arrival in Cuba in the 1850s, but every account agrees on what he became there, the first non-Spanish European to manufacture cigars in Havana. That alone made him an outsider twice over. Havana's cigar trade in the mid-1800s was a closed world, dominated by Spanish and Cuban-born families who had controlled the tobacco fields and rolling houses for generations. A German newcomer had no dynasty, no inherited plantation, no built-in trust from buyers who had been loyal to the same names for decades. So Bock built trust in a different way. In 1865, he founded a factory in Havana called El Águila de Oro, the Golden Eagle, and began producing cigars under his own name. It was a bold move. In an industry built on centuries-old reputations, Bock was betting that quality and clever branding could outcompete pedigree. He was right, but the idea that truly built his empire would not arrive for another 15 years. The Golden Age. Around 1880, Bock introduced something the cigar world had never seen, a small strip of printed paper wrapped around the foot of each cigar, bearing his name and logo. The story passed down through the trade is that the band existed to protect the white gloves of wealthy customers from the tobacco leaf's oils and stains, a small courtesy for high society. Whether that was the real motive, or whether it was really an anti-counterfeiting device to stop black market forgers from passing off cheap cigars as his own, is something historians still debate. Both explanations may be partly true. What isn't in dispute is the effect. Within 2 decades, banning cigars exported from Havana had become almost universal across the entire industry. Every cigar band on every cigar box today, more than a century later, traces its lineage back to Bock's original idea. By the time the 20th century began, Don Gustavo, as he'd become known in Havana, wasn't just a cigar maker. He was a pioneer whose fingerprints were on nearly every premium cigar sold anywhere in the world. His cigars reached the tables of European aristocracy, American industrialists, and eventually the White Star Line's own first-class provisioning lists. The same list that would one day place his name aboard the most famous ship ever built. But behind that success, the empire Bock was building rested on a foundation that was about to be tested by war. The hidden story. Cuba in the 1890s was not a peaceful place to run a cigar business. The Cuban War of Independence, fought from 1895 to 1898, tore through the island's economy and devastated much of its tobacco industry. Many established factories collapsed under the pressure of conflict, blockade, and disrupted trade. Bock did something few of his competitors dared to do. He expanded. While rival factories struggled or shut their doors, he began acquiring struggling operations and consolidating them, eventually forming what became known as the Havana Cigar and Tobacco Factories Limited, turning a moment of industry-wide crisis into an opportunity for growth. It was a remarkable gamble for a man in his 60s, built during one of the most unstable periods in Cuban history. And for a while it worked. Bock's name only grew larger as the century turned, right up until the moment it stopped. The fall. Gustav Bock died in 1910 at 72 or 73 years old, depending on the source. He had spent nearly half a century building a brand from nothing into one of Havana's defining names, the man credited, more than anyone else, with the very existence of the cigar band. 2 years after his death, some of his final cigars, the Bock's Rothschild Elegantes, were sitting in a humidor on the RMS Titanic's smoking room cart, waiting for the 4 men climbing that mahogany staircase. Without its founder, the brand began a slow decline. The 1920s brought a wave of mechanization across the cigar industry, and much of it came at the cost of the handcraftsmanship that had defined Havana's reputation for a century. Competition from cigarettes intensified. Cuban factories that survived did so by leaning harder on the guarantee seals and authentication marks Bock himself had helped popularize, ironically using his own innovation to protect against the counterfeiters, chasing what remained of his fading brand. By the mid-20th century, Bock y Ca had drifted into obscurity. The man who invented the way the entire world recognized a cigar had become, himself, almost unrecognized. The collector's hunt. For decades, Bock's name survived mostly in the footnotes of cigar history books and in the private collections of banderole enthusiasts, a niche but devoted community that collects vintage cigar bands the way others collect stamps or coins. Original Bock & Company bands from before 1910 are exactly the kind of artifact that the community searches for. Small, fragile, printed on paper, never meant to outlast the cigar it once wrapped. Locating a verified example that predates Bock's death, let alone one that could be tied to a specific shipment or voyage, is extraordinarily difficult. Paper survives poorly across a century, and provenance for something this obscure is almost impossible to prove beyond doubt. That's precisely what keeps collectors looking. Not the promise of a certain find, but the possibility of one. The White Star Line's own provisioning records remain the strongest surviving link between the Bock name and the Titanic, a paper trail from a company ledger rather than an artifact pulled from the wreck itself. It's a quieter kind of evidence than a raised object dripping with Atlantic seawater, but historians treat provisioning lists as some of the most reliable sources available, precisely because they were never meant to be dramatic. They were meant to be accurate. In 1998, nearly 90 years after Gustav Bock's death, the Swiss cigar company Villiger rediscovered the old trademark and brought the Bock y Ca name back to life, this time producing cigars in the Dominican Republic rather than Cuba, using tobacco and construction methods entirely different from the originals. It's the same name, but not, in any meaningful sense, the same cigar. The Havana rolled Bock's Rothschild Elegantes that once sat in Titanic's smoking room, humidors no longer exist in production anywhere in the world. Which leaves the story exactly where every great vanished brand eventually ends up, with a name that survives and an object that doesn't. Somewhere in the wreckage 2.5 miles beneath the North Atlantic, or in whatever remained of the first-class smoking room before the ship broke apart, the last physical traces of Gustav Bock's cigars are gone, dissolved by saltwater and time, the same way his name nearly dissolved from memory after 1910. But the idea he had in 1880 never went anywhere. Every cigar band on every cigar sold today, anywhere in the world, exists because a German outsider in Havana wanted to protect a stranger's white gloves, or, just maybe, to stop someone from stealing his name. Some cigars disappear because people forget them. This one disappeared into the ocean. But the market's maker left on the world never sank at all.